shall we? Dale, I'm going to come to you on this first. What's your view on these changes? Are they necessary, or do you think that they are punitive and Labour MPs should vote against them?
I think the changes look necessary to me. From what I've learned today, reading about the proposed reforms, there are genuine reforms in the system. And if you look at the growth of the welfare budget, I mean, £20 billion since the pandemic in the last 5 years, forecast to grow by almost another 20 billion in this parliament, by which time it'll be around about 70 billion and more than our defence spending. And when you look at that, you think something must be wrong. If you look at the statistics, 1 in 10 people long-term unable to work, 1 in 8 young people not in education, training or work. Something's happened. It's like a shadow pandemic, post the pandemic, that has seen the cost of the welfare state balloon. And it's right to look at that system and say, is that system failing or working for people?
I saw you nodding along there. I mean, are these reforms that you guys should have done?
Yeah, I mean, we actually made a lot of changes to welfare in our time, particularly between 2010 and 2015. Ian Duncan-Smith and George Osborne made a lot of changes which brought the welfare bill down. Dale's right. We've seen that go into reverse, particularly since the COVID pandemic. I think the government is right to look at that and say, we're actually a real outlier, particularly on people saying they're unfit to work or people being unfit to work. I think the government's right to focus on not just bringing the cost down, but as we heard there from the Secretary of State about helping people get back into the workplace. I hear that she said, there is emerging evidence that, people having a job is really good for the mental health. I think that evidence has been there for quite a long time. And, look, the Conservative Party may be in opposition. I've never believed in opposing things for opposition's sake. I think they've made some good moves here today. I think the challenge they've got, and we saw this particularly between 2010 and 2015 when we were bringing the welfare bill down, is that there's massive pressure that will come from their backbenchers and the Conservative opposition, because it's easy to talk about making these sorts of cuts. It's very hard to do in practice. I went to debate after debate where Labour politicians were standing up and talking about the increased use of food banks, families going without, tragically, some people taking their own lives because they couldn't cope because they'd lost benefits. That's the reality of what these changes will mean, and it's going to be a very, very difficult time for the Labour Party to shepherd these changes through, even though I believe they're necessary.
Yeah, you can see that resistance among many people who feel very strongly about this. You might be campaigning on this issue, you might be worried about their constituents as well. Jake just picked there on the issue of mental health, because it is true, isn't it, that we've seen an increase in claims around mental health. What's your take on that? Because I guess there's two sides to it, isn't there? Some people might say, well, guess what, some people do have this crippling anxiety, particularly since COVID. You just have to look at the situation for young people to understand why that might be the case. And then others say, well, if that is the case, then work is the best thing to get them out of it.
And I don't think they're competing views either. I think, it could have come out of the pandemic. It probably did. And you've got to ask, have we done enough to deal with that properly within our health system, actually, to help people? And I think absolutely a job helps people that can have a job. It helps to be in the world, to be amongst people. I know when I feel kind of adrift sometimes, it helps to be around people. And I've had some interactions with people on the street, homeless people, who say, well, actually, I offer them a job, and they say, well, I can't work because I've got, this disorder or that disorder. And I say, come on, surely you can. And I think it would be good for them. I think both of those things are true, and I think we have to do more to help people in our country, because no other country in Europe seems to have suffered in the way that we have with this.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think if we knew why it was, we would have done something about it when the Conservatives were in government, and now I think the Labour Party would be if we knew what the real challenge was that our people face. Then any responsive government would be trying to tackle it. I think the wider sort of fiscal argument that Beth made there is quite interesting. Obviously, the Labour Party came in saying we're going to go for growth. We could sit here and I'm sure we'd have a debate about why that hasn't happened. But it hasn't happened. And I think that's why we're seeing the Chancellor really tight on her sums, having to look for these savings. They've started with welfare. I think next week's going to be really interesting. Where are we going to go? I think there's going to be significant pressure on the education budget. I think we'll see pressures across government, the justice budget. And I think so, in terms of the problems within the Labour Party and their own backbenchers, I think their problems have only started today. There may be many more to come.
Thanks both very much.